All right, guys. Well, I'm glad you decided to have me record this lecture. I think it's as an introduction to the physiology of stress. It'll be helpful just to be able to come back to parts of it and to just feel like you can gain a better sense of mastery by reviewing it in the spaces that you want and as many times as you want. So, don't be concerned that we're not coming back to any of this. We are going to be, next time we're together, going to be dealing with physiology of stress also. So we'll continue to build upon what you're working on understanding through this lecture. We met Hans a few times, but here's another quote of his that I think is a good fit. He says, it's not that stress kills us. It's our reaction to it that kills us. And that's what we're going to be paying attention to today. So we've alluded to some of this, stated some of this, and we're going to give a greater level of complexity to this stress response. We know that once the brain's interpreted some kind of sensory information and determined it to be a threat, the body's going to go into action, and it's going to prepare itself to survive the incident. That happens through a chain of command of both neurons or nerves from the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, and hormones or messengers, chemical messengers that have been released by, or their production has been triggered by this perception of a threat, and then this hormone is dumped into the bloodstream. One of the things I think we've talked about early in, or towards the end of week 1 and early in week 2, was the way the brain communicates with the rest of the body. It has two methodologies for that. One, nerves are like a telephone wire. They're a hard wire going from one spot to another. And that means that they can be turned on and nearly instantaneously tell an organ or tell a tissue that it needs to be activated or turned on, or to begin to do whatever action the signal is inducing. But they can also be turned off almost instantaneously. So the brain controls the body in one sense through nerves, and it's a very, very fast and very, very targeted message. So the brain can send a message just to a single individual tissue or multiple individual tissues without sending the same message to the entirety of the body. The other methodology by which the brain has the ability to influence the body is by having different endocrine organs release hormones. So the brain will, via a nerve, tell an endocrine organ or endocrine tissue that it needs to release whatever hormone that particular endocrine tissue is responsible for producing. Hormones are different than nerves in that now this chemical messenger is going to get put into the bloodstream, and you know that your blood goes everywhere from the end of your nose to the end of your toes. And if there's a chemical messenger in that blood, that means it's not going just to one specific targeted area, it's going throughout the body. And it also means that you can't, once you put it into the blood, you can't just say, oh, never mind, stop. That message and that messenger, that hormone, is out there. So we're going to be looking at the interaction between the brain and the body's reaction. So that the combination of those two, the mind-body connection, is called psychophysiology. To get a basic vocabulary together, we're going to start off with our central nervous system. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. Then a separate system is referred to as the peripheral nervous system. And that is all of the nerves that exit out of the spinal cord. So we have these two different primary types of nervous system, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. This illustration from your textbook is trying to show conceptually the organization of the primary portion of the central nervous system, your brain. It's not showing the entirety of the spinal column, but the brain is the area where most decisions or most actions are initiated. The spinal column will be where reflexes are initiated. So if you look at this, you can see that it's organized into 3 separate levels. Again, this is a conceptual illustration of those 3 levels. It's not quite exactly accurate, but it gives you a good sense of brain structures and their basic functions. And it also kind of follows along what we understand currently to be sort of an evolutionary path. So when we look at other animals, the vegetative level that you see there, which is the way that our textbook refers to it, is what's going to be present in the lowest level of animal. As evolution continues, we'll see animals that have brain structures that also include limbic systems, similar to what we have. And then one of the unique aspects of us is that neocortical level. So let's look first at that vegetative level. That is the brainstem and all the related structures to the brainstem. You may remember we talked about the medulla oblongata last class period when we were looking at diaphragmatic breathing. It was the area of the brain that subconsciously controls your breathing rate and depth. It's located at this very lowest level. So you can imagine if we're looking at a very basic organism, that vegetative level is essentially the stuff that just sort of keeps you alive. Let's move up to the limbic system. You can see there's a lot of structures that are named in there. We're going to make reference to a number of them, but I'm not asking you to be accountable for memorizing all of these structures. What I would prefer you are able to do, what I'm expecting you to be able to do, is articulate what happens when a person experiences something they perceive as a stressor that triggers the stress response. And what are the structures that we mention within this class that are activated, and in what order are they activated? What's their response? So let's start to look at that. The limbic system, the fight or flight response is actually activated here. The level has more responsibilities also around emotional processing. And there's structures within this that just have a whole host of different roles. The amygdala, which you do see labeled there, is one that appears to be pretty central in the fight or flight response. It appears that this structure, the amygdala, is really responsible for identifying what is or isn't a threat. It identifies fears, and it really it starts the cascade of effects that we really think of as a fight or flight. It's also interesting that amygdala, that particular structure within the brain, that has a pretty important role within imprinting your memories as well. So if you've ever been had a really bad experience and you've been it was just a really stressful, really bad experience. Think of some kind of traumatic experience that was sort of an instantaneous, a short-term kind of thing, but it was really threatening for you. You might really well remember a number of specific details around that event. You might have a lot of clarity around that particular event. But if you try and remember other things from that week or even that month, that level of detail is not necessarily contained in your memory. And that happens because as the amygdala identifies this information as a threat, it's also going to code in or try to memorize, have you retain within longer term memory the variables around that event so that it can be aware of if these kinds of scenarios, if these kinds of incidents, if these kinds of variables are showing up again, that could be the beginning of that threat again. So it's really responsible. The amygdala is really trying to protect you by by imprinting more deeply some of the memories around there so that it can identify patterns in the future and try to avoid any of those risks. At the top, then, you see that neocortical level. This is the level where we have the conscious power to override the stress response. And if you remember when we were going through breathing there, especially at the very first activity where I didn't tell you anything, but just count the breaths of the other person, most of the time, whoever's being watched, and when they know that you're looking to count their breathing, they intentionally try to slow that breathing down. So that's that neocortical level that's coming into influence there. It's also, that's the area of the brain that allows for the highest level of thought, your ability for creativity, your ability for humor, your ability to analyze things, to imagine and have intuition. All of those aspects are developments out of that neocortical level of the central nervous system. So we can see those different levels of the central nervous system sort of organized into this hierarchy, which this cartoon captures in a slightly different way. So let's start looking at what happens if that amygdala does receive some kind of does perceive something to be a threat. So it doesn't matter what that is. It could be this jack-o'-lantern that a person is seeing, and for whatever reason, their evaluation is that is a very threatening item or a very threatening person. So it doesn't matter what the threat is. It can be something as comical or what seems innocent to you, but the other person, if they perceive it as a threat, then that's what's going to initiate this response. So within here, you see there's the visual stimuli coming into the eye, goes into the visual thalamus, which starts to process that information from just the wavelengths of light into some kind of recognizable idea or image. The visual cortex gives further definition to that, and then that information then is passed on to the amygdala, and the amygdala makes this distinction. Okay, here's what I'm seeing. Is what I'm seeing a threat, or is what I'm seeing not a threat? If the amygdala identifies it a threat, it's going to create a cascade of physical responses as the body really tries to prepare for threats. So our body's going to physically try to respond to a threat, or at least prepare itself to deal with a threat, regardless of whether that's a physical threat, which it would make sense if there's a physical threat to be preparing ourselves physically, but it could be just an emotional or a spiritual or an intellectual attack that makes us still respond in this physiologic way. Let's move away from the central nervous system and give some more vocabulary. So if we move away from the central nervous system, remember the other major neural system was referred to as the peripheral nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is a subcategory, or is a component of your peripheral nervous system. And as you can kind of guess, or you might be able to you might have some intuition based off of its name, autonomic. It's sort of this automatic or autopilot for all of your organs and your basic functioning. It can be influenced by those higher levels of the central nervous system, but its basic role is to keep your body alive on autopilot. And it has these two separations within it. We refer to them as the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And now I know we've used that vocabulary before in class. So that sympathetic nervous system, when it's activated, that's when our body is automatically or in autopilot put into that fight or flight response. The parasympathetic system, when it's activated, it goes into autopilot or tries to organize body systems into a relaxation response. So you also see some vocabulary down here, or the neurotransmitters that each one of them use. Remember, right now we're still talking about nerves. We're at the autonomic nervous system. So these are neurotransmitters, or chemicals that are passed between nerves and tissues to be able to give some kind of message. So epinephrine and norepinephrine are not only a neural signal, but we'll see that they in larger quantity, they're released as hormones as well. So we'll see that a little bit later. The parasympathetic nervous system utilizes a different chemical messenger to be able to get across its message, and that's acetylcholine. So this is really the very first line of your response. The amygdala has said that there's some kind of threat. It activates through the hypothalamus, the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system in particular, if there's a threat. And now we have nerves telling different tissues within the body, you need to respond immediately to be able to help me deal with this particular threat. So what is that response? Where do these nerves go to? Well, here you can see an illustration of both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nerves. And you'll notice that the illustrations or the icons show essentially the impact of the neural signal on different tissues. So at the top, you see if we go into fight or flight, our pupils are going to be dilated. But if you're able to get into more of a rest and digest, then we're going to be constricting our pupils. We're going to spend time now on that green side because that's what we're looking at today. But I want you to recognize the other side, that parasympathetic side, is activating exactly the same tissues, but essentially in the opposite direction to try and bring back towards homeostasis and bring it back to a state of relaxation. But let's leave relaxation for now, and let's say that we have perceived some kind of threat and that fight or flight response has been activated. The central nervous system is sending information out through that spinal cord to all those peripheral nerves, which exit out the spinal cord and now go to all of these tissues to send messages. The peripheral nervous system, since it was a fight or flight, we're activating the sympathetic nerves. And you can see this list of different things that's taking place when the autonomic service, when the sympathetic nervous system has been activated. So the body's going to ramp up and all of these different things are going to happen. We're going to be hitting on nearly all of them, if not all of them, as we sort of continue through understand the physiologic response. So we're going to change just a little bit. This is a change for you to recognize. In this, we've moved from the nervous system. Now I'm talking about the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is a bunch of endocrine tissue or hormonal glands that release hormones. So when the stress response is triggered by the amygdala, it sends a message to the hypothalamus and the pituitary and the adrenal glands. So we have this neural reaction, this straight line activation of a bunch of the different aspects of the endocrine system. And from there, then the endocrine system is going to release hormones into the bloodstream. So of all of those ones that you've seen up there, you may have heard of each of those individual glands, but most likely the one that you've heard more of is the adrenal gland. It's often referred to as the stress gland because of it has such a dominant role in the fight or flight response. So this is going to become the basis of our second and third levels of defense. Whereas the activation, the neural activation of the sympathetic nervous system was our first line. Let's look at the second and third as we kind of continue on through this. Now, we mentioned the adrenals, and a lot of times names will give you a lot of information. A lot of the scientific names will give you information about what it's describing. The prefix AD, the ad of adrenals, means that it's on top of, and renal is just is the fancy Latin name referring to the kidneys. So the adrenal gland actually sits right on top of each of your kidneys. And your adrenal gland has two different parts. You can see it sort of highlighted in that illustrated box there. The two parts include the medulla and the cortex. And the medulla is the section of that gland that's going to actually release epinephrine and norepinephrine in large quantities. This isn't just a nerve that's sending an individual signal to a tissue. Now we're dumping a lot of epinephrine and norepinephrine right into the bloodstream. And you may have also heard of these hormones as adrenaline. So you may, if you're trying to make connections to vocabulary you've used in the past, Epinephrine, norepinephrine, also sort of in common culture, often referred to as adrenaline. The other section of the adrenals there, the cortex, actually releases corticosteroids. So you probably are most familiar with cortisol. So one section releases adrenaline, or epinephrine and norepinephrine, and the cortex actually releases cortisol. And each of these is going to help then prepare the body's energy production for fight or flight. In our second level of defense, or our second level of defense, is essentially the release of adrenaline from the medullary portions of the adrenals. So epi and norepi get dumped into the bloodstream, and that really represents our second line of defense because those hormones are so fast acting. But adrenaline not only is really fast acting, it also actually sort of is fast to dissipate. It goes away pretty quickly. It's amazing how much our adrenal levels can change when we're really stressed. If you are in a significant stress, it's not uncommon to see your adrenaline, your epinephrine and norepinephrine amounts rise by 300 times. So these hormones just flood into the body when their central nervous system has activated these glands telling them to release hormones. They release a lot of that into the bloodstream, and now that circulates throughout the entirety of the body. If we look at some of the reactions then that's going to be able to take place, once the central nervous system, once the amygdala has identified there's a threat, we're going to see increased neural excitability. It just means the nerves are going to work a lot faster. They're going to be triggered a lot more easily, which makes sense. We want not only our sensory nerves and organs to be able to be sending more data, but we also want our own response system to be acting really quickly. You may have already done, or you may soon be seeing that as you increase the stress, you're doing both an emotional stress or an imaginary stress, and you're going to be having them do an actual physical stress by doing exercise, that the cardiovascular system is going to have some pretty significant changes. You're measuring heart rate. You're not measuring stroke volume, but it turns out the stroke volume is actually going to go up as well, which the heart rate and stroke volume combined mean cardiac output will go up. Blood pressure is going to change, and we're going to give some understanding of why that is. We're going to see changes in our metabolic activity as we want to get more glucose mobilized. We actually mobilize protein and fat also. So the body, if it's stressed, it immediately essentially says, give me all the energy sources that we have. And you'll recognize, especially as you look at the protein mobilization one there, that if we're not using those essential amino acids, if we're not using those proteins to build and repair the body, but instead they've been dumped into the bloodstream to be able to be used as a fuel source if needed, that means they're not there to build those other tissues. So we see a decrease in antibodies produced, which means you're more likely, your immune system has been reduced. Its effectiveness has been reduced by that. And if it's really long-term, you can even get to the point of actually seeing muscle wasting because those muscles just aren't being repaired and rebuilt enough. So stress can have a pretty massive impact on you long-term. You see some other components there. I'm not going to read through each one of those. I know that you can read through them if you want or as you want, but there's going to be a lot of things that take place once the fight or flight response has been activated. So let's start to break this down into some individual stages. The first stage, we had sensory information come in to the brain. That information is funneled through the amygdala. And in this example, we're going to say the amygdala has identified something as a threat. Once the amygdala identifies something as a threat, it creates this, or it initiates this cascade or this domino effect, which ends up activating so many aspects of the body to just physically be able to respond to this stress. So the hypothalamus is the next one that's initiated, and it's going to activate that autonomic nervous system that we talked about already. And since this is an emergency or a threat, the sympathetic nervous system or the sympathetic division of it is going to be the one that is activated. The hypothalamus is also utilizing a nerve that goes all the way down to the medulla of the adrenals, is going to tell the adrenals to be releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. And then the hypothalamus, lastly, at least for this slide, the next step is the hypothalamus is going to stimulate adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, which is way easier to say. The full name is adrenocorticotropic hormone, but ACTH is fine. Hypothalamus stimulates ACTH to be released from the pituitary gland, and that essentially is a hormone, not a neural one. So the hypothalamus sent a nerve right down to the adrenal glands. The pituitary is going to send a message down to the adrenal glands, but it's going to be a chemical messenger or a hormone that's going to go in the blood. So it's going to be slower to get there, and it's going to be longer lasting. You can't turn it off right away. And those are going to be kind of some important pieces that we want to be paying attention to. So we often think of cortisol as the stress hormone, but we just saw, or we've just sort of explained, that epinephrine and norepinephrine are actually the first ones released by the adrenal glands. Again, though, epinephrine and norepinephrine are pretty fast acting. They like initiate things really, really quickly, but they also dissipate from the body pretty quickly. And remember, that's also because the hypothalamus has this nerve going right down to him saying, release, release, release hormone. When the hypothalamus, when the amygdala says the threat's over, the hypothalamus is turned down, it's going to stop telling the adrenal glands to be releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine. But the hypothalamus didn't just send via a nerve information down to the adrenals. It also stimulated the pituitary to start up this other line of hormonal defense or messengers. So the pituitary released some hormone, slower to get into the bloodstream, slower to circulate around. It's telling the cortex to release cortisol. And that's why even when a stressor might be over, cortisol can still be in the system. And we're going to see that that's going to have an impact on the body. And that's why we keep referring to cortisol as the stress hormone, because it's the one that persists long term. Once we're stressed, we'll see our cortisol levels rise, and they don't drop very fast. We definitely see our epinephrine and norepinephrine levels rise like 300 times with normal values. That's a ton, but they also dissipate really quickly. So what do these hormones do? As we look at epinephrine and we look at cortisol, epinephrine, remember, it's the illustration here is meant to try and show that that's really the fast acting and that cortisol is really a long acting hormone. But if we look at what they're going to do, both of them are going to increase heart rate. They both increase blood pressure. They make the lungs dilate or inflate. They elevate blood sugar levels. They change our attention and our focus. And they have this depleting effect, or this decreasing effect, on our digestion, on our immune function, our sense of pain, and this other hormone that we'll talk about a little bit more. So that's a lot. You made it through quite a bit. Let's see if we go back here, just a short refresher. The stages of activation: first, the amygdala identifies the threat. It activates the hypothalamus, which tells the sympathetic nervous system to send signals directly off. We're talking about a nervous system, so it sends nervous signals through the nervous system directly to tissues. And we looked at a slide about all of the tissues that it might interact with, although that was only a partial list. The hypothalamus not only has activated the sympathetic nervous system, but it also sends a message down to the medulla area of the adrenals via a nerve, telling the adrenals to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. The hypothalamus also told the pituitary gland, I want you activated, which releases that ACTH. That hormone's dumped into the blood and circulates down and interacts then with the adrenals as well, and tells the adrenals to release cortisol. So that's a slower response system and a slower one to to be able to terminate or to be able to turn off. The last steps. The hypothalamus is a busy beaver here. It's doing a lot of different things. It's also going to be producing ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. You may know of it if you've been through biology as vasopressin. So that hormone, antidiuretic hormone, is going to keep you from losing water out through urination. So it tells your body to retain water. And what that does is it keeps the volume of your blood higher, which means that your blood pressure is going to actually elevate. The last one is a really long, slow process. So the hypothalamus, lastly, also stimulates the thyroid gland, and it tells the thyroid gland to release thyroxine. And this then is your thyroid. You've heard of people with thyroid. It has to do with your metabolism. But this is going to lead to increase in metabolism and a decrease in immune function. But it's not really fast. Your thyroid and thyroxine actually takes a while to be able to produce. So this is a pretty long-term response. If you've ever been in a really stressful situation, you've had a really, really hard couple of days, as an example, and then you've made it through there and you're doing okay, and the crisis and the threat is gone, or at least minimized, handled. But then 2, 3, even a week later, you catch a cold. That is an example then where the production of hormone from your thyroid, which was initiated by the stress response, was telling the body to elevate all of its metabolism, make sure all of that sugar, protein, and fats are available in the bloodstream so this person can deal with this emergency. But it also was depleting your immune system. And then when you were attacked by a virus or whatever it was, your immune system wasn't capable of defending it and you caught a cold. Now, your textbook used this idea of the parable of psychophysiology. Remember, psychophysiology just meant the interaction of the brain and the body. But it had this parable that if you have a really, really, really important message to get across, you don't want to trust it to just an individual single system. So using some life references that maybe you can connect with, the analogy was, if there's this really, really, really important message, then if you're trying to get that across, you might text message or phone call that to whoever you're trying to get that information to. That's a very, very instantaneous kind of thing. And examples of what that might look like for our body's response is we may have a flushed face or a really rapid heart rate. But you don't want to trust just one single system, because you may send a text message, but they may not get it, or you may try to make a phone call, but they may not answer. So if you want to make sure a message is delivered via multiple means, you could also send an email. It's sort of a middle ground thing, right? It can get there really quickly, but it's probably not going to be responded to or seen quite as quickly as somebody who's gotten an IM, or that their phone is ringing because they just got a phone call. And then lastly, in the analogy that the textbook was using, if you're really, really desperate to make sure that this person is aware of this really important message, then you might even send a handwritten note or information via the actual mail and through overnight delivery. So that's clearly going to take even longer than an email. But now you've got these three methodologies by which you're trying to get this really, really important message across. So this is our very last slide. You've made it through a lot of information. But here is some of that analogy sort of put into the vocabulary that we've been using for our physiologic response to stress. So within the immediate effects, we see that epinephrine and norepinephrine coming from the nervous system itself. These are the neurotransmitters being released from the nerves, that sympathetic nervous system, that's super fast, right? Those chemical messengers are being sent from the nerve right to the tissues that they're interacting with, telling those tissues that they need to activate. Like we saw changes in how your breathing rate, and we saw changes to your eye dilation as examples a few slides ago. The intermediate effects. Now we're going to see epinephrine and norepinephrine again. We see adrenaline, but now they're coming from the adrenal medulla. We're seeing them in massive quantities, but they're used now as a hormone, not as a neural messenger. So they're dumped into the bloodstream now, and they're being delivered throughout the body. So that's a longer term thing. First, you have to send a nerve signal down to those glands. Then those glands have to be activated to be able to secrete the hormones into the blood. Then the blood has to circulate through the body to actually get to the tissues that need that message. And then the very last, those prolonged effects, you see that ACTH, you see the antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin there, you see the thyroid hormone being activated. And all of these impacts or all of these effects can persist for days, sometimes even weeks. It just depends on the level of stress that you're experiencing. So you've been through an awful lot of information. As we close out, I would remind you what the psalmist wrote. This is Psalm 139, 13 through 14. They wrote, "For you formed my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well." I know that there's a lot of information contained within this. I hope that you will go back and work on actually drawing out or making some notes, trying to put down concepts in a visual way that just helps you to retain instead of just listening to it. I look forward to seeing you again when we're back together. Have a good rest of your week.